Welcome all hunters, anglers, trappers, and shooters to the only fish and wildlife conservation podcast that goes behind the scenes of the business of conservation, the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Our podcast is hosted by Jon Gassett from the Wildlife Management Institute and Jim Curcuruto of the Outdoor Stewards of Conservation Foundation. Jon and Jim will talk with experts from all sectors of the conservation arena about their passion for conserving the great outdoors. So please welcome our hosts of the Connecting with Conservation podcast, Jon and Jim.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Connecting with Conservation, the only podcast that goes behind the scenes to look at the business of conservation in our country. I'm Jon Gassett with the Wildlife Management Institute and your co-host for Connecting with Conservation. I'm here with my fellow co-host, Jim Curcuruto from Outdoor Stewards. Jim?
That's me.
That's you.
All right. We've had so many episodes, but they're all so different, right? I mean, we talk about all different things on Connect with Conservation podcast, and today we get a different kind of location guest, but U.S., but not U.S. It's a U.S. territory, Virgin Islands, Game and Fish Department, and Nicole's going to fill us all in on what's going on down there, I guess down.
We're going down to the island, man. I know it's my Jamaican
on the islands, man. So welcome, Nicole. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and then the department?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really honored to be on Connections with Conservation. And we're talking about the business end of conservation, which is really fantastic and something that's kind of near and dear to my heart because I actually started thinking about holistic changes in ecosystems as an undergraduate at Johns Hopkins University. I studied abroad in Zanzibar, Tanzania, and I saw raw sewage running through a pipe into waterways where small children were fishing. And I was thinking, we could fix this problem very easily. And maybe I don't want to be a medical doctor. Maybe I don't want to be a researcher. I want to be a conservation practitioner because these are changes that we can make. And I ended up working for what's now Blue Water Baltimore as an AmeriCorps volunteer coordinator for a year in Baltimore City, planting over 2,000 street trees around the city with 1,500 volunteers while I was applying for master's programs and thinking about what really matters and what is going to make my life something that at the end I'm going to look back and have felt fulfilled. And to me, that was working on sustainable development and conservation biology, which is the program I ended up in at the University of Maryland, where I was able to take classes on the Endangered Species Act, environmental ethics, and ecological restoration, which was happening, that was cutting edge in the Mid-Atlantic. But I lived in the Mid-Atlantic a long time. I grew up in Pennsylvania, hunting squirrels with my dad, fishing for trout with my grandfather and my sister, who's still an avid fisher in central PA. And I thought, I want to see what else is happening in the United States. And so I applied for a PhD program at Texas A&M in fisheries and wildlife management. And I entered a herpetology lab. So I was working on broadly amphibians and reptiles. But my advisor, Lee Fitzgerald, was working on a small endangered lizard in West Texas. And I went to the desert and I was like, I'm going to really think about these lizards. And I was so allergic to sand that I was in the trailer for 18 hours every day sleeping and then catching lizards and catching snakes the rest of the time. And I thought, I need a different project. And he said, well, I have this great location for you. And I think you should think about studying the St. Croix ground lizard. And I have contacts at the National Park Service. And when I reached out to them, it was an opportune time because they were about to engage in the first monitoring program since the St. Croix ground lizard was reintroduced to the national park in St. Croix in over 10 years. And they said, we are going to go out and just see if they're there. And I said, well, why don't we set it up in a systematic way? what I'm interested in is statistical modeling and population demography, and how we can improve that using biological factors of the actual animal. And like, how do we, especially for species that are really hard to see, use the habitat that they're living in and the environment and the requirements that we have for the environment, and think about conserving those species and modeling them better. And they said, yeah, absolutely, come down. They're like, we'll give you a car, we'll give you housing. The catch is that you have to remove some invasive plants with the crew. I said, I can do that in the Caribbean. I didn't know at the time, like I knew, but I didn't know it in my soul that every plant in the Caribbean is protecting itself with thorns and protecting itself with caustic chemicals, including urushiol oil. Lots of plants in the Anacardiaceae family, so you're getting the same types of chemicals that poison ivy and poison oaks are providing. And it was really tough work, and I was down here for 3 months, and I thought, I'm never coming back. So I called my advisor, and this was before we had any hybrid class learning. And I said, I'm not coming back. Do you think everyone's going to let me Skype my classes? And he was like, well, you can try. And so I've really been down here ever since. So I'm coming up on the 14th year that I've been in the Virgin Islands on and off. I spent some time at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, working on a long-term data set over 200 years with 3,000 specimens from across the Caribbean, thinking about how lizards maybe had changed as their environments and as predators were introduced, mongoose, cats, dogs. And then I was working for the U.S. Geological Survey's Cooperative Research Unit in Alabama on similar issues with endangered species. And we were working on what then was new for the Fish and Wildlife Service, the species status assessment. So I worked on several species, including the eastern black rail, and thought I really could continue working in the Caribbean. We did an SSA for the Puerto Rican boa, which I, was really encouraged by what we were finding when we did expert elicitation with stakeholders in the Caribbean. And the job as the chief of wildlife for our state Fish and Wildlife Agency, which is under our Department of Planning and Natural Resources and is our Division of Fish and Wildlife. It started before there was a Department of Planning and Natural Resources in 1942. And we, at the time, were receiving federal aid funding for wildlife restoration. We continued receiving that funding through 1950, when we began also receiving our Dingell-Johnson apportionments. And in 1970, when Public Law 91503 amended the Wildlife Restoration Act, we began to receive 1/6 of 1% of the total apportionment for wildlife restoration. And that's largely because we didn't have the numbers. Since that time, the 1970s, if I look back on federal aid applications, it says, how many residents do you have in the U.S. Virgin Islands? Approximately 100,000. We still have approximately 100,000 residents. We're never going to sell the types of numbers of licenses that would allow for us to get a reasonable apportionment for the land area and the water area that we're managing. And so that opportunity was so exciting. I said, I am going to retire as the chief of wildlife for the Virgin Islands. And 4 months after I started, their director retired, and they asked me to come in an acting capacity, and 6 months later as the director of the division. And so my first Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies meeting, I was so overwhelmed, because I was sitting on the panels, I was representing the U.S. Virgin Islands, and I looked around and I said, this is really, really gosh darn cool, because we are conserving the same species in the same ways, and I'm going to be able to communicate that to the rest of the Southeast. And also now with my colleagues at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and at all of the different state agencies, we're going to be able to communicate what we're doing and why we're putting our funding dollars to really good use. I think people do have that question. Why are the Virgin Islands getting any federal dollars for conservation? And it's because we're sharing northern pintails, green-winged teals, golden plovers, leaf sandpipers, western willets. We're getting all those species coming down here, and that's not even to mention some of our species of greatest conservation need that we've recently classified with our most current update in the State Wildlife Action Plan, but also some of our federally listed endangered species like roseate terns, who are the most genetically diverse in the Virgin Islands, but also the largest breeding population of that species. So it's been a wild ride, and I'm coming up on 7 years. And so I was I was thinking last year, I was like, what are we gonna do? And Jon had been so persistent at all of the North American meetings and coming up and saying, we can help you. And I finally said, I want to take Jon up on it. And so we've been engaged in a strategic planning process that has really, I think, uplifted our agency and thinking about what our functions are and moving forward. So I'm feeling really lucky to be here, really lucky to talk about this and communicate it. And I'm excited to hear about what kinds of questions that you both have.
Well, it occurs to me that when you describe that, the why do you get federal aid? Why do you get PRDJ funds? It's no different than, we send money to Canada for migratory waterfowl management because that's where they breed. We send money to Mexico and South America because that's where they winter. And these long distance species, you have to take care of them where they occur. You can't just take care of them in the middle or you don't have them. So it's and you have a unique situation down there. I've been down there once now and I've really enjoyed it and looking forward to coming back. But the diversity of species that you have to be a small group of islands, and then the aquatic species. You got great sport fishing opportunities all around the islands that's pretty much year round, but it's almost an untouched resource, an untapped resource because most people don't think about it. They go sport fishing out of Florida, they go maybe to the Bahamas, or they don't think about St. Croix or St. Thomas or St. John's, and it's beautiful there and it's great fishing, and it's very very similar to a vacation in the Cayman Islands. It's like nobody fishes there, and I'm like, you don't even have to have a license, you just go fish, but nobody does it. And it's wonderful fishing, but it's just not what they do.
And I think that some of the sport fish here that we had that in places like Florida, we would be the envy of. Like tarpon are so abundant and so dense that folks are feeding them it like off of the boardwalk, which they're not supposed to do. But there's so many, and there's so tarpon are so charismatic. We've had a catch and release policy for tarpon since the mid 90s, and it shows. We have an incredible population that you can go fishing for inshore. Going offshore fishing for wahoo and mahi, those are your most consistent sport fish species. Right now, we just had a great run of wahoo. Everyone was talking about it. We had our guys and gals tournament this past weekend, and some of those fish that were coming in, we were getting I think there was an 8-pound red snapper. Just really exciting fish for the sport fish and charter industry. And we have a great charter industry that some folks do pass over. Jon, you're right. And the most common passover for us is actually coming to the Virgin Islands to take a boat to the British Virgin Islands. And they just have such great marketing campaigns. They have great fish too. Lots of interchange of families and customs and species. The Northern Virgin Islands were all connected. Puerto Rico, the USVI, and the British Virgin Islands were connected 8,000 years ago. We have very similar faunal communities in the Northern Virgin Islands. And we have great sport fishing right here. And your sport fishing here supports Dingell-Johnson dollars that are going back into conservation of those species that are migrating across our waters and our international and our interstate borders.
Yeah, and if you're not eating wahoo, in my opinion, it's the best fish in the ocean to eat. It is absolutely fantastic. I just wish I could catch more of them.
So I get caught up on little things like this, but so you said you were allergic to sand, but now you're working on islands. Walk me through that one there.
I know it is so humid here, and I don't know about you guys, but during the spring and in the fall, I get crazy allergies, and the plant communities are different enough that my allergies aren't impacted here. They are also different enough that our regional species of greatest conservation need for the Southeast have lots of overlap for our vertebrates and invertebrates, but almost no overlap at all for our plant communities. We have really historic plant communities here in the Virgin Islands, and they, in most of the connections that we had with commerce and migrations were from South America. So the Carib people were moving up the Lesser Antillean chain. Lots of connections were made in the Virgin Islands between Tainos, Caribs, several other Kalinago people, and that history shows in our faunal community and in our floral community. We have huge numbers of invasive species here, and some of those are just non-native and have naturalized through those historic migrations of persons, but lots of recently introduced species for agriculture, including as late as the 1880s and 1890s, as sugarcane economies started to change. They became more industrialized. There was a greater demand for more sugarcane, better sugarcane, more external pressures on plantation owners. And what ended up happening was that lots of species were introduced in that time period for biocontrols, and introduced in ways that have impacted the communities now forever. But I would also say that wildlife restoration dollars have given us some interesting species. So wildlife restoration has actually funded the introduction of bobwhite quails to St. Croix, where they persisted for some decades. And white-tailed deer are found across the Virgin Islands. Some are historically introduced in the 1790s when Danes passed through the Americas, brought deer here for hunting. But in the 1950s and 60s, wildlife restoration dollars were funding white-tailed deer to be brought from Texas to St. Thomas to the Virgin Islands for hunting purposes. So there's a strong history and ethic of hunting here, public access, and sustainable use of species that were native, but also species that have been introduced.
All right. Well, yeah, such interesting stuff. Different but the same. So talk about the same. I think I heard you have some shooting ranges, built by excise tax dollars on one of the islands there as well, or?
Yeah, so we have had archery programs run throughout the territory, primarily through different schools, and over the past decade or so at an archery range that was created on St. Croix that is run by the department, which is completely funded by excise taxes. Some of my staff, after going to a recent meeting, laughed because I was in one of the partner with a payer videos that was produced, and what I talked about were the hundreds of opportunities that young people have to practice archery, as well as visit two 3D archery ranges. They're on private lands, but we've provided the targets, and they provide some of the supervision and maintenance of those ranges. And we've been working with the Archery Federation of the Virgin Islands because there is such interest. And I think that's as we move towards having more sustainable use and harvest of species that we do have here in the Virgin Islands, we'll be focusing on for our terrestrial work. I tell a lot of folks, like in the last 5 years, I really focused on recreational fishing. We just launched our recreational fishing license, Go Outdoors USVI, in August. And so when you come to the Virgin Islands to go fishing for tarpon, wahoo, and mahi, you're going to be purchasing a fishing license. And all of that's coming back into our programs and conservation programs. As you move forward, you may also see some of those sustainable use tags and licenses showing up on that platform. We're developing them now, but we need to put the policy into place to make sure that we're able to flexibly manage our fines, our fees, our seasons. We have lots of changes in seasonality. Sometimes people think, you're in the Caribbean, it's going to be the same weather all year round. the animals have historically co-evolved here, and they sense 10 degrees of difference in the winter. I sense it now too. When it gets to about 65 degrees, which is about the coolest it gets here, I need a blanket. I need a quilt. I'm glad my mom sent me my quilts. In the summer, it's 10 degrees hotter at night, and it really is truly hot, and we're getting different species come through. There was really beautiful writing by George Seaman. He was one of our naturalists, grew up here, Native Virgin Islander, and in 1949 was tapped to be, in my position, the director of the Division of Fish and Wildlife, and he was in that position until 1969. And he writes, before he came to the division, every year he went out to a state whim. So we have, instead of municipalities, what we call estates that were used for tax purposes by the Danes. And on the 16th of September, in 3 successive years, golden plovers arrived to St. Croix in a state whim. On September 16th, the first year he was excited. The second year he looked back in his notebooks. The third year, he was like, how could this be here again? And he just thought about seasonality. He thought about what was happening. He thought about migratory birds and migratory species, how they journey safely, they get to spaces on time, and that's where he moved the division. He moved us towards looking at migrations of fish and migrations of birds, and that's what we've really focused on. All of our federal aid dollars from the 60s, 70s, 80s through today, you look through, you're going to see white-tailed deer, you're going to see migratory birds, you're going to see wetlands, and you're going to see great sport fish.
Cool. Well, I think a lot of people don't realize that there's tremendous topography on your islands for islands. Most people think of islands as kind of low and flat and sandy, and as Jim alluded to earlier, but they're quite mountainous. I guess it's volcanic in origin, or it's at least a thrust fault escarpment or something. So they're kind of, there's quite the elevational change just driving across St. Croix. And
that's an interesting point, because the variety of types of jobs you need to manage the landscape don't change because the landmass is so small. You still need your wetland biologists. You still need engineers. You still need your maintenance techs. You still need your biological technicians. And they can't be in all places at all times. We have it always shocks me here, this number, we have over 220 dams just on St. Croix. We're 26 miles by 7 miles wide. We have 200 dams. We have hundreds of ponds. And we're managing all of those. And so to get into a space where we can really think about landscape cover change on St. Croix, what I had really been doing a lot of research and thought on before I came to the division was that these are novel ecosystems. They're managed. They were completely clear cut. In some cases, they're secondary successional forests. In other places, they're still managed agricultural forests. And so we need all of our stakeholders at the table, whether it's through working with farmers for biodiversity best management practices or to access their ponds. We have relationships with a lot of farmers and golf courses to inventory birds that are coming in on their migrations or who are resident. And I think that idea of novel landscapes colors a lot of the work that we're doing in different ways than it does in other island communities. For example, in the Pacific, they're really thinking about getting back to a space where they have natural ecosystems. I think we're far removed from that reality because we have so many invasive species. And we talk about Florida having more invasive than native species. We do too. And so instead, thinking about the slow decline of a lot of our native species and then which species we want to bring back or conserve helps us prioritize. It's hard. We have really limited dollars. 1/6 of 1% of the apportionment is a small amount of money. I was actually looking at the federal aid reports for 1970 today. We got the same amount of money for wildlife management in that year that we actually got last year. And so sometimes when we're thinking about what we can do reasonably, it's hard to think beyond the box because we really have to prioritize. And what we have been thinking about is how transformed landscapes can actually help us direct change on the landscape so that we can bring back some of these birds that we really love, that we can impact some of our streams that have great populations of American eels, so that we can direct our enforcement officers to spaces where we know poaching is happening for some fish species, and work with what we have.
Well, I mean, I appreciate all that you're doing there. And another thing, so I always pick out little things here and there. And you mentioned that you're part of CIAFWA. And then, I want to explain to the audience here, every state has a DNR, and now we have U.S. territories that have their own DNR, Department of Natural Resources or Fish and Game Department. But there's an overseeing group, AFWA, Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and then there's 4 regional groups, the NIAFWA, the Northeast AFWA, CIAFWA, Southeast AFWA, and then MIAFWA, Midwestern AFWA, and WAFWA, Western AFWA. So there's, individual states, there's regional states, and there's a national organization. So you're part of CIAFWA, and explain what CIAFWA is and what other states and how you work together with those guys and how that helps you.
Yeah, I think one of the most important functions of those organizations is convening. We convene with our other southeastern states, so our Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Our partners also come to those meetings, so we can all sit at the table and talk about how to amplify our conservation dollars. We all have limited dollars, and the borders that are geopolitical for us are not the borders that animals are seeing on the landscape. And so the Southeast, I think, has taken a really progressive look at how to stay at the forefront of conservation with landscape scale initiatives that benefit hunters and fishers, streams and watersheds. We're looking at where animals are breeding and where we're actually interacting with those animals for sustainable harvest and for different types of uses. We're thinking about working lands and forests, and that's through a collaborative effort. I wouldn't say at all that these are the types of organizations that are anything but completely voluntary, collaborative, and for convening purposes. We think about things that we need, and we might make committees. Those committees change over time, and they're always with the idea that we have more power in sharing our resources. We're separate, but really unified in our goals. And that has been useful for us specifically because and this is always the stance that I'm going to take. So, take it or leave it. I think there's a lot of in-kind initiative that gets done at the federal level that doesn't trickle down to some of the states and some of the territories and some of the tribal nations. We don't receive some of the same data sets that states receive for free. We brought to DC a list of 16 data sets that every state uses every day for conservation decision making. And we either had to apply for money to be included in the initiatives, or we just don't have them and had to make our own analogous data sets. So the entire Southeast decided that we were going to have a conservation blueprint where we thought about prioritizing spaces for land management and that it would cross borders across states. And the U.S. Caribbean wasn't specifically included. And I was able to go to CIFWA, the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and say, we also need this resource because some of your breeding birds are in our backyard and we want to help you conserve them. And we were able, and it took about 2 years, but we were able to create or find those analogous data sets. And it was so wonderful to see that actually happen on the ground for us because we didn't have a way to amplify the impacts of conservation that was happening in the Southeast before we received this resource. And so data inequities are really a huge issue for us. And that idea of being separate but unified in our conservation goals has guided what fights and battles we've chosen to fight and which ones are okay to accept.
Well, and I think I was hoping you'd hit on that I think another huge benefit to those, a lot of people refer to them as trade associations. It's the collective bargaining power sort of concept. It's not just shared resources, it's political power when, if you need something as the Virgin Islands, if you're by yourself, you're shouting into a hurricane. But if you have a dozen southeastern states standing right there with you shouting, that's a ton of power when you need something done in DC.
Exactly. And I think that is something that we're going to need to use more and more, because one aspect of management that we really haven't gotten into is the active management piece. We've been doing a lot of inventory and monitoring at the Division of Fish and Wildlife for almost 80 years. And we have not started sustained restocking programs. We've recently been given stewardship of land, and we have a few different spaces where we are going to engage in fish hatcheries, and we are going to engage in stocking programs, and that is our next step. That is our next big step, because the landscapes that we have are what we have, but what we can do to enhance them is to give some of our species a leg up. They were lost because of historical land use and clear cutting and slash and burn agriculture, and now with secondary successional forests emerging, we can restock those spaces. So we actually have the habitat. It's not going to be a huge lift for those animals to propagate in those spaces because the habitat's back. Habitat is the key for species conservation for us. The same with our coral reefs. So part of what we're going to start with that hatchery is looking at life support systems for some of our invertebrates, our oysters, and our scallops. We're putting them back out into reefs and in our mangroves, where a lot of our sport fish are breeding, and using them as nursery spaces. And so we need really good habitat so that lots of those young can grow up and become dinner on the end of my rod.
Right. Well, I definitely appreciate all you're doing with limited resources, managing resources, but tell us, I guess, where we can find more information on visiting the U.S. Virgin Islands and recreating there, whether it's fishing or, bird watching or all the stuff that you have to do down there.
Yeah, your first stop is our website, which is dpnr.vi.gov/fish-and-wildlife / that website is going to take you to our invasive species programs, our wildlife programs, our fish programs, and our Go Outdoors USVI licenses. You can also just Google that. We're going to come right up. And if you have any questions at all, our information, we have an information space that you can just request more information on what you would want to do. But some of the regular tourism aggregators that you use are going to have the best information possible. You're going to come down, you're going to kayak in the Bio Bay at night, you're going to watch the moon rise over the easternmost point of the United States at Point Udall, and then the next morning you're going to go sport fishing and hook a wahoo. It's pretty incredible, because then the rest of the day you're going to sleep on the beach. And it's not a bad place to be, even when we're worried about everything else in this world, when we're worried about dollars, when we're worried about what food we're putting on the table. Instead, like on the weekends, and every single night, I am going to the beach. I am looking at shorebirds. I am looking at water birds and adjacent habitats. And you can do all that here, and we have information so that folks can get down and join us.
So, and an interesting little factoid, Jim, that I learned when I was down with Nicole the last time is that a couple of those beaches are fairly famous, but, most people don't know it. But if you've ever seen the movie Shawshank Redemption, the beach scenes where Morgan Freeman's walking down the beach, that's where it's at. It's on St. Croix. That's where it was filmed. So I've got to go back just so I can walk on the beach with my shoes in my hand to pull my Morgan Freeman invitation off. So. Well, Nicole, thanks for joining us. It's always a pleasure talking with you. We appreciate what you do. We realize the unique challenges that the Virgin Islands face, and I hope our audience now has a greater appreciation for, islands have their own unique characteristics and their own unique challenges, but they also have tremendous opportunities too. World-class fishing, places where species occur where they don't occur anywhere else. So thanks for all you do down there. We really appreciate you. And to our listeners, thanks for listening. If you like the show, give us a thumbs up. Subscribe if you would. That'll help you because you'll find out when the next show is going to drop. And other than that, we'll see you in the woods or on the water. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Please do us a favor and tell your buddies, friends, family, and others about what you've learned here today. If you like what you heard, come on back anytime and listen to another episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast.